Okay. All right. Welcome everybody to NDA's second town hall on COVID-19 federal business relief. Today we're going to be discussing phase 4 legislation and our government affairs update and activity to date on COVID relief. We'll be joined by our host, Kevin McKinney, who will give our update and go through some of the current legislation and actions that are being taken. Before we get started, I wanted to thank Dennis McGarrell, our chair of the NDA Government Affairs Committee, and Kevin McKinney, our director of government affairs, as well as Alex McIntyre with NDA for all of their work throughout these last 5 months. Our government affairs efforts have been extremely busy. Kevin has spent some fairly long weeks, especially back in May, April. So thank you for that. And Dennis, thank you for all the work on the committee. So before we begin, NDA just recently did a survey, and I wanted to give the results of the survey to everybody here on the call so you can get a sense of where NDA members are at and just a slim snapshot of the industry writ large. So we had 10 questions that we sent out. We sent this out in April and then again in May, and we just closed it last week for our fall snapshot on how COVID is affecting our members. So our first question was, has your company experienced work stoppage related to COVID-19? Surprising 33% or a third of respondents said none to date. And then we had another third, 1 to 3 projects were stopped as a result of COVID. And then the remaining 4 to 6 projects, so another third, when COVID hit. Our next question was, how has your company backlog been affected by COVID-19? Surprisingly, a quarter of our members that responded, so we had about 65 respondents, not at all, 25%, backlog not affected. And then the remaining 50%, 1 to 3 months. So we are seeing some projects that are being put on hold. So the backlog is being affected, but not nearly as much as the construction industry writ large, which in some cases you're seeing larger industrial commercial contractors, their backlogs have shrunk 2 to 3, 4 months. So demolition industry is faring a little bit better than the rest of the construction industry. What safety measures has your company taken in response to COVID-19? 90% of respondents said that they have adopted NDA's COVID-19 exposure prevention preparedness and response plan. For those of you that aren't familiar with this or don't have it, it is available free for members and non-members on NDA's website. If you go to COVID-19 resources under the membership menu bar, it's free to download and you can customize that for your company. The other 80% have implemented daily toolbox talks on COVID mitigation. Our next question is, are you working on any emergency relief projects? So about 15% of our members are currently working on projects. And that ranges from COVID-19 cleaning of military bases, decontamination efforts, wastewater plants and roads and bridges, decontamination of buses, as well as working on some of the riots, the vandalized buildings. If your state has issued essential service guidance, has construction and demolition been included in that? And this we're seeing as we look at all of the states across the country, but 90% of our members have told us their states have designated demolition as an essential service. Has your company furloughed, laid off, or instated a hiring freeze? 66% said none of the above. So, and then of those that answered, we're looking at 10% who have furloughed, and then hiring freeze is another 20%. So really the industry, again, as I said earlier, is not being affected quite the same way that the rest of the construction industry has been. And then final question was, how has your operating budget been affected? We have not at all at about a third. So again, the demolition industry is faring a bit better than the rest of the industry, construction. And then 20% reduction in budget is a third of our respondents. So, and then our final question is regarding travel. How likely are you to travel, personal or business, in the next 12 months? Very likely is almost half of our participants in the survey. And then likely is the other third. So again, our members are out there, they're in the field, they're working on projects, working through projects right now. So having said that, Kevin, I just wanted to frame that before we get into your presentation. I will hand the floor over to you, Mr. McKinney. It's all you.
Great. Thank you, Jeff. And hello, everyone. Great to be with you. What I'd like to do today is just start with a recap of the actions to date from the federal government on responding to the COVID pandemic. So some of this will just be a brief recap of some of the relief programs that are in effect, including the Paycheck Protection Program, which I know is very popular. And then we'll pivot over to the current status of negotiations on additional legislation. So you may have seen reports that Congress is considering another round of relief legislation. The House of Representatives actually did pass that already, and it's really coming down to the Senate and the negotiations that are taking place there. So we'll get into kind of where those negotiations stand, what NDA is doing, what our legislative priorities are for that right now. And then lastly, I'd like to just touch on NDA's regulatory efforts currently. You know, COVID has kind of changed a little bit of the landscape with regard to a lot of the regulatory activity that NDA engages in. So we're still engaged in that, but I wanted to just kind of frame where those actions stand, and then a bit of information I received this morning regarding the Beryllium in construction rule and some activity on that. So we'll touch on that towards the end. So just as I mentioned briefly, I'd like to recap some of the actions regarding where things came from for where we are with this type of legislation. Phase 2 that you'll see on the screen here, this is a piece of legislation that Congress passed in an effort to respond to COVID. And this is really where some of the legislation started to have a lot of teeth in terms of having an effect on employers. So this was signed on March 14th. And one of the things that it did, which NDA reported on at the time, was required certain criteria for paid leave for employees. So there's a requirement to provide 2 weeks of paid sick leave to any employee who was unable to work due to a variety of criteria that relate to COVID, everything from having to quarantine, experiencing symptoms, even to caring for someone that has COVID or caring for a child in a school that's been closed. So NDA reported on that when it took place. That piece of legislation also passed $1 billion for unemployment insurance, which we're going to talk about coming up. And tax credits were created to offset the requirement for that paid sick leave mandate. So that's what phase 2 did. And really, though, the next one is phase 3, really where we get into a lot more of the really impactful pieces of legislation here. So this was signed in late March. This was a big one for NDA because this was the piece of legislation that created a lot of those small business lending programs that helped businesses stay afloat. And NDA's position originally, when the pandemic was really taking hold, was that we want options for our demolition contractors as they're weathering the COVID pandemic. So we want them to have the ability to access low-cost loans, things even for forgiveness for certain uses of those funds. So that's what NDA was lobbying for phase 3. And we were successful in getting that $350 billion for those lending programs, in particular the Paycheck Protection Program, which I'll talk about some of the details of that, but that was a big success. We also saw some reauthorization of funds after this, but this was the first round of allocation for those programs that we were very happy about. And then in addition, you probably all are aware that It also authorized a round of cash payments for individuals. It was up to $1,200 in cash for individuals making up to $75,000, or full payment starting for people up to $75,000 a year. And then it would phase down from that until you reach $99,000 per year, and it gave $500 per child. So this was an effort to try and put money in people's pockets as they were navigating it, especially with situations where people were being reduced in hours, laid off, furloughed, things like that. So we're going to talk a little bit about the phase 4. So that was phase 3. We'll talk about phase 4 coming up in my section on where things stand currently with the negotiations. But I want to just cover a little bit about the Paycheck Protection Program, which we've been reporting on over the past few months. This has been a very popular program across the country for a lot of small businesses. And this is an SBA approved program, but it is administered by lending institutions. So it's administered by the federal government, but all of the funds are distributed by banks. And so as a business, you go to your local bank and receive that loan there. Now, it's capped at $10 million per loan, but the important part of a Paycheck Protection Program loan, if you're not particularly aware, is that you can be eligible for forgiveness for certain uses of the funds. So for example, if you get a Paycheck Protection Program loan and use, let's say $100,000 for payroll, that is eligible to be forgiven later on. And you have to apply for that forgiveness through SBA. There's a form you would need to fill out, but that's one of the attractive points for PPP loans, is the ability for forgiveness. So the things you can use these loans for are payroll, health insurance, mortgage and rent payments, utilities, things like that. So it's basic things that go into running a business, keeping it going when a lot of this stuff gets affected by a drop in business because of COVID. So the eligibility for this is 500 or fewer employees. So if you have over that, you're not eligible for a PPP loan. There's some other options that are available for larger companies, but PPP loans are designed for more smaller businesses. So they limit it to 500 or fewer employees. S corps, sole proprietorships, independent contractors are all eligible to receive these loans. You had to have been in business since February 15th of 2020 and paid taxes on your employees or independent contractors. In addition, the loan terms, it's 2.5 times.
I got to talk to you later. I'm sorry.
Hey, Jeff, can you just mute yourself? Thanks. Payroll includes, in terms of what is the eligibility for payroll, in terms of what qualifies under that forgiveness, is salaries, commissions, tips. Employee benefits are included in the definition of payroll. State and local taxes, compensation to sole proprietors or independent contractors. So that's what goes into the eligibility for payroll. The maximum loan size is $10 million, and the current fixed interest rate is at 1%, but Congress did allow for the rate to be increased up to 4% as the maximum. So currently the interest rate on PPP loans is 1%. So there are some attractive terms. And like I said, NDA's priority going into this legislation is, or when this program was implemented, was providing options for our members. We want to see more options and then have our members be able to take advantage of them as needed. So we talked a little bit about some of the things that go into what is eligible for forgiveness. And the Small Business Administration has issued guidance that at least 60% of the forgiven amount should be for payroll costs. So you have to use at least 60% of PPP loan funding for payroll to be eligible for forgiveness. So that's an important point. You can't use all your loan money for utility payments, for example, or your rent payments. You have to use 60% for payroll. So that's an important point. The whole point of that program was to provide employers with an option to keep their employees paid. So they're making sure that those funds are being used for predominantly payroll expenses. So just switching gears to the other popular loan program that was given money in that phase 3 program. These are economic injury disaster loans. These are administered directly by the Small Business Administration. This allows for loans of up to $2 million. And one of the attractive components of an economic injury disaster loan is that if you apply for this loan and you receive or you're approved, you can receive up to $10,000 of an emergency grant within 3 days of applying. The actual amount you receive is dependent upon the number of employees you have. So if you have 8 employees and you apply for an economic injury disaster loan, you can get an $8,000 cash grant within 3 days. And these funds can be used to pay debts, payroll, accounts payable, rent, similar to PPP. However, these funds are not eligible for forgiveness. The emergency grant is that I mentioned, you don't have to pay that back, but any amount above that emergency grant has to be paid back. So if you have 8 employees and you receive a $20,000 economic injury disaster loan, you have to pay back $12,000 because you will be, that $8,000 because of the number of employees is considered a grant, and everything above that needs to be repaid. These funds also cannot be used for the same payroll and overhead costs as PPP funds. So that's an important consideration as well. And it's another option, again, for our members, and want to make everybody aware of that. And we reported on this when Congress passed this into law along with PPP, and there's information about it on our website as well. In terms of eligibility for these loans, this is, again, eligible for small businesses. So they're capping it at 500 employees. Nonprofits, cooperatives, these are all eligible as well per the Small Business Administration's subsequent guidance. The current interest rate for businesses is 3.75%, and there's no personal guarantee required for any loans that are under $200,000. And the other attractive thing about these loans are that payments are deferred for 12 months. Now, like I said, for the forgiveness amount, it depends on how you look at this, whether you want to call it forgiveness or not. That $10,000 grant, or it could be less depending on your number of employees, is dependent upon, like I said, it's dependent on your number of employees, and that amount does not need to be repaid, but you do have to pay back anything above that. And more information about this loan program is available on the Small Business Administration's website. Unlike PPP loans, this program is administered directly by the Small Business Administration. So that's something to know. If you're interested in this type of program, you would go to the Small Business Administration directly, and that website on their screen is the best place to do that, although you could just go to the Small Business Administration's website, and it would be very easy to find as well, all their COVID-19 relief related stuff. I also wanted to touch briefly on the Employee Retention Tax Credit. So this was created to, again, provide another option, for employers who are seeking to experience some relief from COVID. So there's no size limitation for if you can claim an Employee Retention Tax Credit, but an eligible employer has to meet these criteria that are on the screen: is fully or partially suspended in response to governmental orders limiting commerce, travel, or group meetings, or has experienced a significant decline in gross receipts, which they use that it's defined as a decline of 50% or more in quarterly receipts when compared to the prior year's quarter. And one of those bullets there on the screen is the criteria to qualify for this tax credit. And that tax credit is equal to 50% on the first $10,000 of wages. And the credit is based on wages incurred or paid from March 13th, 2020 through December 31st, 2020. But it's important to know that if you receive a Paycheck Protection Program loan, you're ineligible to receive an Employee Retention Tax Credit. So that's an important thing to consider as well. It's one or the other, and there's different reasons why you might go for one or the other. I'll just note that as a recap for PPP, that's only up to 500 employees in terms of eligibility. So if you have over that, this might be, a better option if needed, if some kind of relief program is desired, by that company. So that's another option. And then another one is the delayed payment of payroll taxes. So the relief legislation that was passed, it does allow employers to share. It allows employers, to defer their share of the 2020 payroll tax for the remainder of this year. Okay, so up to December 2020, you can defer those payments. However, that is not a forgiveness of the payments. So you'd have to repay the government over the next 2 years. So you wouldn't have to pay this year, but starting next year in 2021 into 2022, those need to be repaid. And the payroll tax deferral period covers the period from March 27th through the remainder of this year. And as I mentioned, that 2-year period, the first half of the deferred payroll taxes have to be repaid by the end of next year, so December 31st of 2021, and then the second half would be due by December 31st, 2022. There's no size requirement for employers who want to defer their payroll taxes. However, if you have a PPP loan, you're not eligible to do this. I also want to note, and I'll touch on this further in some coming slides, but the president did sign an executive order that defers all payroll taxes for workers who make less than $100,000 for the remainder of 2020. That's going to be challenging, to hold up, because he's probably going to get sued over that. So we'll talk about that in a moment. And what I also wanted to mention is regarding going back to the Paycheck Protection Program for a second. I've neglected to mention that currently the PPP program is expired. However, one of the things that we're advocating for, and I'll talk about this coming up as well in terms of our priorities, is reallocation of money and the ability for employers to apply for PPP loans. So just wanted to mention that even though it's an option and has been an option, it's currently expired. Although if Congress passes more legislation on phase 4, which again, we're going to talk about, we're advocating for them to reauthorize some money and ability to apply. So I just wanted to note that. The other one is unemployment. Now, this one is an interesting one. It's one that the Government Affairs Committee has been talking about over the past few months, just hearing some reports and feedback from employers who are a little bit concerned about the level. So the expanded unemployment benefit allowed $600 per week as an additional supplement to the regular unemployment that an employee would be receiving. So they'd be receiving whatever their unemployment would be under normal circumstances, and then added $600 per week on top of that. So all states are participating in that. And because of the feedback we've been receiving from employers, we are lobbying currently for a reduction in the $600. And it's important to note that we're not outright opposed to any relief for employees, anybody who's needs an unemployment benefit. NDA is very conscious of that and wants to be very reasonable with regard to those types of situations. But we want a balance too. We would like to see a good balance so that workers can receive their needed additional benefits, as that is, and then also though taking into consideration things like distortions in the labor market and the financial impact of the $600 as well. So a lot of our lobbying right now is focused on finding that common ground with that level and what the supplemental level is. As I mentioned, I did mention Trump had signed some executive orders, and again, we're going to talk more about that, but I wanted to mention on the unemployment part, he did sign one that extends unemployment benefits to $400 per week because Congress allocated money for the $600 per week. However, that expired, and so President Trump signed an order that extends that benefit at $400, so it went down by $200. Again, this is going to be possibly subject to a legal challenge. I expect he'll probably get sued over it, but that's just kind of where things stand currently. Okay. So now I'd like to pivot over to the legislative issues, okay, that are currently going on right now. As I mentioned, the House of Representatives has passed their legislation already with regard to another COVID relief bill. So it's not currently law. The things you're seeing on your screen are not law, but these were passed. These are some of the provisions that were passed by the House back in May. It was a piece of legislation called the HEROES Act. That includes expanded PPP eligibility. It includes additional funding for PPP loans, and then some additional things that help individuals such as rental mortgage assistance. It eliminates the cap on state and local tax deductions for 2020 and 2021. Currently, if you'll recall, NDA reported, this is going back a few years, on Congress passing legislation that limits the state and local tax deduction to $10,000. And so this legislation would eliminate that cap for this year and next year. It allocated $3.1 billion for workforce training, and it does keep the $600 per week supplemental unemployment benefit through the remainder of 2020. So again, this is not currently law, but this was passed by the House of Representatives back in May, and we now are in a lot of discussions with the Senate with regard to their bill, and that's what's been taking some more time with regard to working out a deal. So in the Senate, they did introduce some legislation that provides some additional relief. Although, again, this has not been made into law. Their proposal would allocate $190 billion for more PPP loans. The big one that I want to touch on is the 5-year employer liability protection. Now, this is a priority for NDA because there's a concern about liability and lawsuits with regard to COVID. And, we don't want to see our members fall into, legal issues while they're complying with all required regulations, federal guidance, things like that. So the proposal that NDA is supporting is a 5-year employer liability protection for, quote, the good actors. So this would apply to if a company is following those regulations for a safe workplace, if they're shown to be complying with things like CDC guidance, they should not be subject to a lawsuit if an employee gets COVID, especially considering it can't be proven where they were to contract the virus. So this is an important one, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of from an outlook perspective coming up. The Senate's proposal reduces the unemployment to supplemental benefit to $200 per week. So very big difference from the House. Again, they want to keep the $600. The Republicans are proposing the $200. And the Senate actually did include those additional direct stimulus payments that I mentioned earlier. So those are some of the things that stand out in terms of their proposal, although, again, it's not law and it's going to require some additional negotiation between the Senate and the House and the White House. And certainly an election year really complicates things. So, yeah, in terms of that outlook, then, the discussions really are kind of at a standstill right now. So currently, Congress is not in session. Typically, during the month of August, they are back in their home states. And that's especially true this year because it's an election year. So a lot of them are doing campaigning, although that is a challenge these days with COVID, but they're not in session right now. It seems like there's going to be some concessions that need to be made on both sides if they're going to come to an agreement on additional legislation. And the earliest something really could come together is probably middle of late September, but even that could be a big challenge. I mean, as of right now, nobody can really determine a path forward or when that is. So, but we're continuing to lobby, especially the Senate, and our priorities, which I'm going to talk about in a second, are really top of mind for us in that additional legislation. Regarding our priorities, these are a snapshot of the things that NDA is lobbying for in any subsequent legislation. So I mentioned that liability protection, that's an important one, a reduced supplemental unemployment amount, which, we're looking for a compromise on that. We're not, we're willing to be considerate of particular circumstances for unemployed workers, but we just want a workable system. We're supporting a payroll tax cut for the remainder of 2020. We want to see additional rounds of PPP availability. So as I mentioned, the PPP program is currently expired, but we want to see Congress reauthorize that, give it a fresh round of funding, and ensure that our contractors have the option, if they need it, that they can go and apply for that type of loan. And overall, we want to see more options for our members, not less. The other one is comprehensive infrastructure legislation. So this one is likely an uphill battle, but infrastructure is one of those key issues for NDA and has been for quite some time. It's always been an elusive issue in Congress because Democrats and Republicans kind of can't, even though they agree that infrastructure is a good thing, they can't agree on necessarily what to do. And it is a big lift to do infrastructure legislation in Congress. So, but we wanted to make sure that we were going on the record and saying, as part of any COVID recovery approach from Congress, we do think that infrastructure should be part of that effort. Everything from streamlined permitting to funding for particular projects. So that's part of our priorities as well. We want to see DOL take adopt a posture that's more helpful for employers rather than strictly focusing on enforcement. And we also want to see expanded access to COVID testing. And this could take the form of making sure that state and local jurisdictions have the testing that they can test, or that employers are able to ensure that their workers can be tested and comply with state and local regulations as needed or guidance. So we want to see more of that as well. So this is a snapshot of our priorities with regard to phase 4 legislation. And we're going to keep talking to the Senate, talking to the House about, look, these are their priorities for the demolition industry. We want to see these included moving forward. And so we're going to keep at that. So I also wanted to touch on, just briefly, I did mention the executive actions by President Trump. I just wanted to cover them. This will just take a second. This was signed back in early August. I mentioned that it allocates it's a $400 per week supplemental unemployment benefit, which had previously expired. The interesting thing about this one is that 25% of that $400 has to be funded by the states. And I've seen a bunch of states have kind of balked at that idea that they're going to pay 25% of that. So that's going to pose some challenges in certain states. New York comes to mind as one example, just because Governor Cuomo was pretty forceful in saying, absolutely not, I'm not going to do that. So that's going to be interesting how that gets implemented. I think it's really just going to come down to Congress needing to pass a supplemental benefit if it's going to be continued. There's an eviction order protection, not so much of huge relevance to the industry, but it was one of the ones that Trump did sign, and it was really just exploring options for eviction protection. It didn't stop evictions. And then the payroll tax deferral. So this applies to workers that are under $100,000 per year, and it defers payroll taxes from September 1st through December 31st. And this is aimed at giving a little bit of a cash boost for workers for the remainder of the year. And I mentioned the legal issues here. So there's a big question about whether President Trump had the authority to do this. There are some who would say, sure, yes, he did. There are some that would say, no, he stepped over Congress's jurisdiction. They're the ones who have to authorize all of these things. And so this could get dragged into court, but it's probably going to be overshadowed by Congress and Congress taking action if they so do, possibly next month, let's say. So it's a little murky, but these were signed by the president earlier this month. And in particular, the unemployment portion and the payroll tax deferral are the two that really stand out as relevant to the industry. What I wanted to also do is just touch on NDA's regulatory efforts. So as I think everybody is aware, NDA spends a lot of our advocacy working with federal agencies and responding to regulations, responding to proposed rules, presenting guidance to our members on particular pieces of regulation. So that's always been a focus for NDA particularly in terms of the past 5 years or so. The COVID pandemic has really put a damper on a lot of the regulations that are coming out of agencies like DOL, OSHA. A lot of those things have been kind of put on the back burner because of the virus. So a lot of the things that NDA has previously weighed in on, things like powered industrial trucks, lockout, tagout, the silica rule updates to Table 1, these things were slated originally to be issued this year. But again, they've kind of been stalled. So we're continuing to monitor all of that as needed, and we'll be responding absolutely as needed if those things are to be issued, and make sure that our members are always aware of them. What I did want to touch on is a recent kind of, there's some chatter this morning about the Beryllium and construction rule. So last year, OSHA put out a proposed rule on beryllium in construction, and NDA weighed in on that proposed rule with written comments submitted to the agency, and we've been waiting for that rule. So there's been some information that's come out this morning, not in an official capacity, but there's been some chatter about OSHA is going to publish an FAQ on this issue, and they're going to clarify that when performing tasks at a construction site, exposure to common building materials containing trace amounts of beryllium, such as rock, soil, concrete, brick, will normally not trigger the requirements of the beryllium standard in construction, such as the requirement to assess and monitor exposures triggered by handling, processing, or otherwise being exposed to these materials on construction work sites. So that could be a very positive thing. Some of our concern, among other things, with that was compliance and some of the requirements that were proposed by OSHA. So just looking at this chatter, there could be some positivity with regard to OSHA's actions on this rule. That's really all the information we have right now on this, but OSHA is probably going to be publishing information about this coming up shortly. So we'll be on the lookout for that, and we'll send that out to our membership as soon as we have it. So I just wanted to give some advance notice of that coming down the pike at it could be this week, or it could be in a few weeks. But once it does, we will make sure that our membership is informed on that. So, and that concludes the content portion of what I have for today. What I wanted to do is, if you have questions, be happy to take them now in the chat box. But I also wanted to provide the emails for our staff here. So Jeff Lambert's email is there, along with my email and Alex McIntyre, who works on our government affairs team as well. Anytime you'd like to ask us a question or raise a concern from a government affairs perspective, if there's a legislative or regulatory issue that you have questions about or that you think NDA should be involved with, please feel free to reach out to us at any time. We always appreciate hearing from members, and always happy to hear those concerns. And so please feel free to take those emails and use them as you see fit. So I'll go ahead and pause for a moment if anybody is interested in putting a question in the chat box, or I'll just give a few seconds for that, and then we'll see where we are. But for now, thanks very much for joining, and I'll give it a minute, see what questions we have. Thanks. One more point I wanted to mention as well is I'd like to touch on NDA's grassroots opportunities. And so we've talked about this before. You might have seen some information in our newsletter or on our website about this. A successful lobbying operation really consists of two primary components. There's a direct lobbying component, which is what our staff does day to day. And then we have our grassroots component, which is really where we help our members get directly engaged with the federal government. And this is a great opportunity because it provides a lot of useful information and context to both Congress and regulatory agencies. And hearing directly from NDA members is a great way to keep them educated and informed about really critical topics. So I encourage you to visit our website and check out our current grassroots engagements. One of the ones that is really pressing right now is on the Phase 4 legislative priorities that we talked about on a few slides ago, those priorities are in the format of a grassroots alert. So you could go onto our website and go to that alert. You can take, in just a few clicks, you can send a letter to your congressman, to your senators, and really urge them to include these priorities that are important to the industry in any subsequent legislation. So just wanted to emphasize the importance of grassroots. We've really seen an uptick in grassroots engagement over probably over the last year or so, which is very encouraging and really just shows that there is interest in our membership for getting engaged with government affairs. And so I'm very appreciative of that. And we'll continue to push information out about our grassroots activity. And that'll be a great complement to the direct lobbying activity that we do. Let's see. We have a question from Dennis. Is there a general consensus on how the employer liability will ultimately be determined? That's a good question. The employer liability piece is the tricky, probably one of the more tricky parts of this legislation. And the reason for that is because Democrats really don't, want to see this type of provision included. And probably the only reason that it's continuing to be seen as a real issue is because Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell is really making sure that that is included in a Senate bill. So that's really one of the reasons why the discussion is staying alive. I think that the Democrats really aren't going to be part of that discussion on what is going to be the criteria for the employer liability protection. So it's really going to come down to the Senate Republicans who are the ones crafting that. And right now, McConnell seems to be very much in favor of that 5-year protection. He seems very adamant about it has to be at least a 5-year protection. And he said he won't pass any legislation out of the Senate, if that's not included. So that's an important point as well. So that's kind of how it's going to go. We're going to continue to talk to the Senate about that, but right now I think the liability piece will be determined by the Senate Republicans, and it'll be a minimum 5-year because McConnell is really pushing that. So, and what I'd like to do, if everybody can just hang on for 1 second. The last thing I'd like to do before concluding our webinar, and I appreciate everybody joining us today, is to show you, I mentioned our grassroots advocacy, our Grassroots Action Center. So I wanted to show that, and let me see. So this is our Grassroots Action Center. And if you go, let's say, take action here is what you would do. You'd put your information into this field, and it would take you right to a pre-typed form letter that you can send to your elected officials. And so this is a great tool for our members to use that they can take action on a variety of legislative issues and regulatory issues for that matter as well. So that can be accessed by going to our advocacy tab. You can go right to Grassroots Action Center, and the system does all the work for you. So it's a great tool that you can use to take action with your elected officials and regulatory agencies. So I encourage everybody to check that out, and it's a great opportunity. All right. Well, that is all I have for today. I want to thank everybody for joining. Jeff, do you have any parting words that you want to add? But otherwise, thank you, everybody. And please feel free to reach out at any time if you have any questions. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Kevin. And thanks, everybody, for joining. And again, thank you to Dennis, Kevin, Alex, and the Government Affairs Committee for all the hard work over the last 6 months. Thanks, everybody.